Caleb woke to the sound of something dripping. It was slow, deliberate, like each drop was being coaxed out by hand. He didn't sit up right away. The ground beneath him was warm, almost the same temperature as his skin, and it was soft in the way ash is soft, fine, gritty, but ready to cling to anything that touched it. When he finally did push himself onto his elbows, dust lifted into the air and hung there, reluctant to settle. The sky was not so much dark as stained, an ugly brown red like dried blood rubbed into paper. He could see movement above, not clouds but smoke, folding over itself in sluggish waves. The smell was sharp and dry, like an electrical fire that had been burning for hours. He didn't remember how he got here. A figure sat on the curb across from him, head bowed, elbows resting on knees. The man's clothes looked like they'd once been a work uniform, though the patch on his chest had been burned away. His hair was the color of old rope, and his face was pale except for a thin slash of sunburn across the nose. Without looking up, the man said, "You're not bleeding." "That's good." Caleb wasn't sure if that was meant to be reassuring or just a statement of fact. He coughed, tasting something metallic in the air, and asked, "Where is this?" The man finally looked at him. His eyes were gray and restless, like he was looking for something to disagree with. "You're in the blocks, Zone 6. "Is that a city?" The man huffed a short laugh. It was. Behind them, the street stretched in both directions, lined with buildings that all seemed to sag in the middle as if their bones had softened. Windows had been replaced by empty holes, and here and there, laundry lines still stretched between rooftops, though the clothes that hung from them were stiff, some melted into strange shapes. A woman with a broad frame and a limp passed by carrying a bundle wrapped in canvas. The shape inside it shifted once, and she adjusted her grip. She wore a respirator mask, though the filters looked old enough to be useless. "New one?" she asked the rope-haired man without slowing. "Dropped in about an hour ago," he replied. She gave Caleb a glance, sharp and brief, before continuing down the street. Her limp slowed her enough that Caleb could see where she was going, toward a crowd of people clustered around something he couldn't see. The rope-haired man stood and brushed off his hands, which only smeared more gray dust into his skin. "If you can walk, you should come with me. They're handing out water. It'll be hot, but it's something." Caleb followed, though he kept glancing at the buildings. Every so often he saw movement in the shadows inside. Not full figures, just the suggestion of someone ducking out of sight. The crowd around the water line was larger than he expected. A few people sat slumped against walls with tin cups in their hands. Others stood in line, but it wasn't orderly. The line wavered and folded in on itself whenever someone pushed through. At the front, a squat man in a blackened apron ladled water from a barrel into whatever container people brought him. Bottles, jars, a dented metal teapot. The water was the color of tea left out too long, and steam curled off its surface in the cold air. Two boys darted through the crowd, both barefoot, both quick enough to avoid the hands that tried to grab them. One clutched a flat piece of metal, the other a bundle of wires. "They'll get caught one day," the rope-haired man muttered, but there was no real conviction in his voice. Someone ahead of them in line, a tall man with a missing sleeve, said, "Nah, they won't. Kids like that, they either starve fast or live forever." The rope-haired man grunted, but didn't answer. The smell of the water hit Caleb's nose before they reached the front. It was faintly sulfurous, and something about it made him think of a rusted drain pipe. He looked at the faces around him. Most people avoided eye contact, their expressions flat with a kind of practiced patience. A woman near the back held a baby whose face was wrapped in strips of cloth, leaving only a dark, wet patch where its mouth must have been. The rope-haired man eventually got his turn, filling a battered flask. He drank first, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, then handed it to Caleb. Caleb hesitated before sipping. The water was warm enough to feel alive in his throat, like it might squirm if he swallowed too quickly. The rope-haired man noticed his hesitation. Better than nothing. Name's Ash. Caleb, he said, though the name felt dry in his mouth. They stood there for a moment, watching the line move, before Ash said, "Don't wander too far from here, at least not alone. Some of the blocks have sunk." Sunk into what? Ash didn't answer. He just motioned for Caleb to follow, walking back the way they'd come. The path Ash took was less a street and more a gap between leaning buildings, their upper floors so close that their shadows blurred together. Caleb followed, ducking under a sagging clothesline where rags hung like dried seaweed. The further they went, the more the air thickened, not with heat, but with smells. Cooking, maybe, or something pretending to be cooking. A salty, metallic tang lingered beneath it. "This way's faster," Ash said, though he didn't seem in any hurry. He moved with the ease of someone who knew which places to step and which to avoid. Twice he nudged Caleb toward the center of the path, away from jagged holes in the ground where the ash-colored soil had caved inward. The edges of those holes were smooth, too smooth, as if something had been rubbing against them from below. The passage opened into what might once have been a market square. Long tables were set up beneath patchwork awnings, though the fabric sagged with dust and damp. Vendors stood behind the tables, selling objects that didn't look like food until you stared long enough. One woman sold rows of jars filled with pale strips curling in cloudy liquid. Another man, bald and smiling with teeth too small for his mouth, had heaps of dull, powdery berries piled on a tarp. "Don't eat the red ones," Ash said casually as they passed. "What happens if you do?" "They eat back." Ash didn't elaborate. A group of men sat cross-legged on a blanket nearby, playing a game with hexagonal tiles etched in lines and dots. One of them, thin and twitchy, kept glancing up at Caleb like he was trying to place him in a half-forgotten memory. From the other side of the market came the sound of hammering. Caleb craned his neck to see a short, wide woman in a leather apron working on something that looked like a cage, though it was oddly shaped, with rounded edges and a hinged opening on the side. A boy sat nearby holding a bucket of bent nails, straightening them one by one with a small mallet. Ash stopped at a stall draped with yellowed netting. The vendor, a woman with hair like black thread, was cutting thin slices off a slab of something gray and fibrous. She placed the slices into a square of cloth before tying it into a pouch. "For the road," Ash said, handing her a few flattened coins that looked more melted than minted. Caleb glanced toward the edge of the square. A man in a patched coat was trying to sell a single shoe. Not a pair, just one. He kept holding it up, calling out a price that shifted every few minutes. A little girl with a shaved head stopped to look at it, but moved on quickly when he asked her name. Ash passed Caleb one of the cloth pouches. "Food. You'll hate it, but it won't kill you. Probably." The food inside was dry and almost weightless. It smelled faintly of wood smoke. Caleb didn't open it. "Where does all this come from?" Caleb asked, gesturing at the stalls. "Depends. Some's grown here, some's found, some's brought in by runners from other zones. You'll meet a few of them sooner or later, if they like you." A shout went up from somewhere behind the cage maker's stall. The hammering stopped, and a man staggered into view, clutching his arm. His sleeve was shredded, and the skin beneath looked wrong, as if it had been turned inside out. He collapsed onto a bench while two other people rushed to him with strips of cloth. No one screamed, no one ran. A few glanced over, frowned, and went back to whatever they were doing. Ash didn't slow down. They left the market through a narrow street lined with buildings whose walls were carved with rows of strange, shallow grooves. Caleb ran his fingers across one as they passed. It was smooth, almost polished, like the tracks left by rope pulled too many times over the same spot. "Where are we going now?" Caleb asked. "Somewhere with walls," Ash said. "Nights are worse." Ash led Caleb through another crooked alley until they reached a squat building that looked like it had been built from whatever had survived a fire. Blackened brick, warped metal panels, chunks of concrete stacked together without symmetry. "This is the hold," Ash said. "It's not the safest place in Zone 6, but it's where I sleep." Inside, the air was thicker, heavier. The only light came from oil lamps hung in shallow alcoves, their flames barely moving. The floor was uneven, patched in places with sheets of corrugated metal. A long room stretched ahead, lined with bedrolls, crates, and makeshift tables. The people here didn't glance up much when Caleb entered, though a few pairs of eyes lingered long enough to make him uncomfortable. A thin man with a neck that seemed too long for his body was playing cards with a woman whose arms were covered in overlapping scars. She laughed suddenly, a sharp, unexpected sound, and the lamp nearest to them flickered, casting her face into something gaunt and hollow before returning to normal. Caleb blinked, wondering if he'd imagined the change. On the far side of the room, a man sat sharpening a blade that was more hooked than straight. He paused to spit into a small metal cup, though when Caleb passed behind him, the cup was empty. "Pick a spot," Ash said, nodding toward a section of wall where two bedrolls lay unclaimed. Caleb dropped his pouch of food onto one of them. The fabric was thin and gritty with dust. From somewhere above, faint scratching echoed, slow, deliberate, like claws dragging over stone. It wasn't constant, but it came in bursts, pausing just long enough to make the next sound sharper. Ash noticed him looking up. "Don't stare at the ceiling too long. You'll start to see faces that aren't there." Before Caleb could ask what that meant, a door at the far end of the hold banged open. A short, wiry woman entered carrying a basket of small glass jars. Inside each jar, something pale twitched. Not quite worms, not quite fingers. She began handing them out to people without a word. When she reached Ash, she gave him one and nodded toward Caleb. "He's new," Ash said. The woman looked Caleb over, her eyes dark and still. Then she handed him a jar. The thing inside writhed once, then stilled. "What is it?" he asked. Ash popped the lid off his own jar, scooped the pale thing out with 2 fingers, and tossed it into his mouth. He chewed without expression. "Protein," he said finally. "Eat it before it starts moving again." Caleb hesitated, the smell faintly sweet and rancid at the same time. But when he looked around, he saw everyone else eating theirs too, some quickly, some with slow, deliberate bites. The wiry woman collected the empty jars without comment. As the night settled, the hold grew quieter, though not peaceful. Outside, something large scraped against the walls, not constantly, but in slow, circling movements. Once it let out a long, low sound that vibrated in Caleb's chest more than in his ears. No one else seemed alarmed. A man near the door was telling a story in a low voice about a sinkhole in Zone 4 that swallowed an entire watchtower. He laughed halfway through, saying, "They didn't even hear it go." Just turned around and it was gone. In the far corner, a woman sat carving small shapes from chunks of bone. Caleb couldn't tell what they were meant to be, but each one had holes where eyes should be. Ash lay back on his bedroll, hands folded over his chest. "Sleep if you can," he said. "Dreams are better than looking at the dark too long." Caleb lay down, though his eyes kept finding the seams in the walls where thin lines of shadow bled through. He told himself they were just cracks. But then one of them shifted. Caleb kept his eyes on that shifting shadow, half expecting it to stop once he noticed. It didn't. It slid upward along the seam in the wall, slow and fluid, as if gravity had decided to work differently for it. From the corner of his eye, he checked the others. No one seemed to notice. The card game continued. The bone carver kept shaping her eyeless figures, and Ash lay still with his hands over his chest, breathing evenly. The line reached the height of the lamp. The flame guttered, stretching sideways toward it for just a moment before settling back. The shadow didn't vanish. It slipped over the edge of the seam and out of sight, as if retreating inside the wall. Caleb sat up, but stopped when he caught the bone carver looking at him. She didn't smile or frown, just tapped the point of her carving knife against the bone twice before going back to work. A sound drew his attention to the door, a muffled thud from outside. Then another, closer, heavier, like something was leaning its weight against the entrance. The door frame creaked softly. Nobody moved toward it. Instead, the long-necked man dealt another round of cards, his fingers quick and precise. He said, 2 more knocks, and it'll leave. 4, and it's hungry. Caleb looked to Ash for confirmation, but Ash's eyes were closed. The third thud came, louder this time. The lamp nearest the door swayed, though the air stayed still. Someone muttered, "Not tonight," under their breath. The fourth thud rattled the metal sheets on the floor. Caleb thought he heard a faint huff of air afterward, like the sound a dog makes before deciding whether to bite. Then, nothing. The hold stayed in that kind of silence where every creak of the building sounded like a whisper meant only for him. Minutes passed. Slowly, conversation returned. A boy entered from a side door, carrying a small sack over one shoulder. His hair stuck out in dusty clumps and his left hand was wrapped in a filthy bandage. He made his way to the bone carver, set the sack down, and opened it. Inside were several objects: a cracked ceramic bowl, a handful of rusty nails, and something that looked like a chunk of hardened honeycomb, but darker, wet in the middle. The bone carver picked up the honeycomb thing, turned it over in her hands, and asked, "Where?" The boy shrugged. "Between the sunk blocks, near the canal." She set it down and passed him a small bone carving in exchange. He took it without looking at it, stuffing it into his pocket. Ash opened one eye and said quietly to Caleb, "That's not for eating." "Not for people, anyway." Caleb didn't ask what it was for. A draft swept through the room, though none of the doors had opened. The lamps wavered again. This time, the long-necked man placed his cards face down and glanced toward the far wall, the same wall where Caleb had seen the shadow move. He said, "It's early." No one answered, but one by one, people began blowing out their lamps. Ash did the same, his face unreadable in the sudden dark. In the quiet that followed, Caleb thought he heard faint movement inside the wall. The same slow sliding sound as before, only now in more than one place. The dark was thick inside the hold, not just from the lamps being out, but from the way the air itself seemed to swallow what little light came from the cracks in the shutters. Caleb sat with his back against the wall, forcing himself not to lean too hard. The sound came again, the slow scrape followed by a dragging hush, as though something inside the wall was shifting a layer of dust to make itself comfortable. But now it wasn't just one place. The noises multiplied, faint but distinct, moving in separate lines that sometimes crossed each other. From somewhere to his left, a man whispered, "Don't answer if it calls." "Calls?" Caleb whispered back before realizing it might have been meant for someone else entirely. The man didn't reply. A few feet away, the long-necked man shuffled his cards in the dark. The sound was strange without sight to match it, crisp, dry clicks against his palms. He began laying them out on the floor, one at a time, murmuring something between breaths. Caleb couldn't make out the words, but the cadence felt rehearsed, like an old rhyme. The scraping in the walls paused. A long silence stretched over the room. Caleb felt his chest tighten as though something were leaning in from the other side of the wall, listening. Then, very softly, it knocked. Not the heavy, hungry pounding from before. This was a gentle tapping, almost polite. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Someone in the corner laughed under their breath. The sound was low and humorless, but it broke the stillness. The scraping resumed, sliding downward toward the floor. The wiry woman with the jars spoke into the dark. "It's looking for the gaps. Count your breaths. Don't break the count." Caleb glanced at Ash, but Ash's eyes were closed again, his lips moving slightly. In the quiet, Caleb started counting, slow, even breaths, each one an anchor in the blackness. Around him, the room seemed to settle into a shared rhythm, dozens of breaths sinking together until it felt like they were all part of one body. Somewhere in that rhythm, Caleb thought he heard another breath, one that was too slow, too deep, coming from the wall itself. The scraping stopped again. A moment later, something small and brittle dropped from the seam above his head and landed beside his bedroll with a soft clink. He reached for it, hesitating when his fingers brushed against it. It was cold, hard, and shaped like a finger bone, but thinner, more jointed. Before he could examine it further, Ash's hand closed over his wrist. "Leave it." Caleb pulled his hand back. He could still feel the shape in his palm, even though it wasn't there anymore. A creak came from the ceiling. This time it was followed by a faint, wet sound, like cloth tearing underwater. The bone carver muttered something sharp in a language Caleb didn't know, and the sound stopped. The night dragged on that way, long stretches of stillness, broken by the occasional scrape, knock, or shifting weight somewhere above or behind. Caleb lost track of how many times he thought it was almost over. When the first light bled through the shutters, it wasn't much, just a dusty orange smear across the floor. But people began to stir. Someone relit the lamps. The long-necked man gathered his cards. The bone carver set down her knife and began wrapping her carvings in cloth bundles, tucking them into a wooden box with metal hinges. Ash sat up and stretched, his movements deliberate. "You did all right," he said to Caleb. "Some don't make it through their first night here." Caleb tried to think of a response, but stopped when he noticed the seams in the wall. In the morning light, they were gone. No cracks, no shadows, just smooth, unbroken surface. Morning in the blocks wasn't bright so much as less dark. The rust-colored sky bled through the gaps in the shutters, staining the hold in a dull orange that made every surface look older than it already was. Caleb woke to the sound of boots scuffing on the uneven floor. People moved without urgency, but they moved with purpose, gathering up bedrolls, tying pouches to belts, folding bits of cloth and tucking them into pockets. A smell hung in the air, faint but warm. Boiled grain, maybe, or something standing in for grain. From the corner, the wiry woman with the jars ladled a thick, beige paste from a dented pot into small bowls. The steam carried an earthy, almost mushroom-like scent. "Eat before it cools," Ash said, passing Caleb a bowl and a short, wide spoon carved from bone. The paste was smooth and dense. It stuck to his spoon like clay and left a faint film on his tongue when he swallowed. Across the room, the bone carver sat with her bundles in front of her, counting them. The little boy from the night before was there too, holding a new carving, a flat, oval-shaped piece with grooves running in concentric rings. He turned it over in his hands, frowning, as if trying to work out its purpose. A low whistle cut through the morning chatter. Everyone paused and looked toward the doorway. A tall man with a split lip stood there, holding up a length of twisted metal. "Runner from Zone 5's here," he said. "Brought scraps." A few people got up immediately, Ash among them. Caleb followed out of curiosity. Outside, the blocks felt different in daylight. Not safer, just more visible. The buildings loomed the same, but the details stood out now. Patches of melted glass clinging to window frames, ash drifts piled against doorways, a long, dark streak along one wall as though something had been dragged there while still burning. The runner was a thin woman in a heavy coat, the sleeves patched with strips of mismatched fabric. She had a cart with 2 wheels, piled with metal scraps, old tools, and something wrapped tightly in cloth. People approached her in 2s and 3s, offering coins, cloth, or jars in exchange. Caleb noticed one man try to hand her a pouch of the pale worms from last night. She shook her head sharply and said, "Not fresh." Ash traded her 2 bent nails and a strip of wire for a small metal tin. When he opened it, there was nothing inside but a single hinge, shiny and new-looking, despite the dust. "What's that for?" Caleb asked. Ash shrugged. "Hinges are always worth having. Something always needs opening or closing." Near the cart, a group of children played a game involving small, dark stones. They arranged them into shapes on the ground, then wiped them away and started again. One boy drew a long, crooked line with the stones that looked oddly like the seam Caleb had seen in the wall last night. The boy noticed Caleb watching and grinned, not friendly but not hostile either, before scattering the stones with his boot. As the cart emptied, the runner pulled the wrapped bundle from the bottom. She set it on the ground and began untying the knots. A hush settled over the gathered crowd, like they all knew what it was but didn't want to say it out loud. Inside was a piece of pale, ridged material, curved like a fragment of a giant shell. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if it were still wet. Ash leaned toward Caleb. "From the sunk blocks. You don't find many in one piece." "What is it?" Before Ash could answer, the bone carver stepped forward, inspecting the fragment closely. She touched one finger to the surface, then jerked her hand back as if it had bitten her. Without a word, she turned and walked away. The runner didn't try to sell it after that. She wrapped it back up and slid it into the bottom of the cart again. By mid-morning, the square began to clear. People went back to their work, mending, sorting, scavenging. Ash motioned for Caleb to follow. "Time to earn your keep," he said. "We're going to the edge." The blocks thinned out as they went, the buildings giving way to wider, emptier streets where the ash lay deeper. It clung to Caleb's boots like wet sand, though the air was bone dry. They passed a wall with deep indentations, spaced too evenly to be natural. Each one was perfectly round, about the size of a man's head, and inside each was a lump of something fleshy, pale, and pulsing faintly. No one in their small group, Ash, Caleb, and a quiet older man with a limp, gave it more than a glance. A movement in the gutter drew Caleb's eye. Something long and jointed, with too many knees, was crawling along the edge. Its surface glistened like it had been oiled. It moved without hurry, occasionally stopping to tap the ground with a thin black spine protruding from its front. Ash stepped over it without looking. As they walked, the road began to crack in places, the gaps filled not with rubble but with a coarse, wiry growth that looked like dried grass but twitched as they passed. From a nearby doorway, a curtain of some fibrous material hung. Not cloth, but something more like matted hair, coarse and gray. The breeze, if there was one, moved it slightly, revealing the dark space inside before it fell still again. Caleb thought he saw a shape shift in that darkness, but when he looked harder, there was nothing. They crossed a small square where the ground sagged slightly in the middle. At its center stood a tall, thin structure made from intertwined ribs, actual bone, or something that only resembled it. Bits of fabric and metal trinkets dangled from the higher points, moving gently. The older man with the limp muttered, "It's grown taller." No one responded. Further on, the buildings were replaced by low mounds, their surfaces smooth and dark, as if glazed. The mounds were studded with holes the size of coins, and from some of them, a faint, damp breath drifted out, smelling of rust and wet stone. Near one of the mounds, Caleb spotted a cluster of small, pale creatures huddled together, hairless, their skin almost translucent, with slow, blinking eyes. They didn't scatter when the group walked by. They just watched, their heads tilting slightly in unison. The air grew warmer as they neared the end of the street, and a low sound, like the distant roar of the sea, but steadier, began to rise. Ash stopped at the last intact wall before the road ahead dropped away into open space. He leaned against it, watching Caleb take it all in. "This is the edge," he said. "We don't go past it unless we have to." Caleb stepped forward. The road ended abruptly, not in a cliff, but in a slope of shattered black stone descending into a hazy, shifting expanse. The air beyond wavered, bending light in strange ways, and here and there, dark shapes moved. Not close enough to see clearly, but close enough to feel. Somewhere far below, something let out a deep, slow groan, and the ground beneath them vibrated, mourning in the blocks just enough for the ash to shift under Caleb's boots. Ash didn't seem to notice. The wind, if it could be called that, came from the haze. It moved in shallow breaths, warm and damp, carrying a smell like stone dust after rain. The air between the blocks and the expanse shimmered, not with heat, but as if something in the distance were bending the space itself. Caleb stayed a few paces from the drop. The slope was made of black fragments that glinted faintly when the light shifted, as though the ground had once been molten and then shattered in an instant. The older man with the limp crouched near the edge, picking up a piece of that black stone. He turned it over in his palm, frowned, then dropped it back. The sound it made when it landed was strangely muted, like it had fallen into deep dust rather than hitting rock. From far down in the haze, something floated into view, a shape both massive and thin, like the rib of some long-dead creature, except it was moving. It swayed as if caught in a current, but the air here was still. After a few moments, it tilted and vanished into the brightness. "Always bigger down there," the older man said, not looking at Caleb. "And always further away than you think." Closer to their right, along the slope, a group of low, hunched forms picked their way upward. Their movements were jerky but steady, like marionettes pulled on too many strings. Each had something trailing behind it. Long, tangled lengths of what looked like vine or intestine dragging through the black fragments and leaving faint trails. Ash leaned on the wall, watching them. "Scavs," he said. "They won't come near us unless we've got something shiny." One of the hunched shapes paused halfway up the slope. Its head, if it had one, turned toward them. Even from here, Caleb could feel the attention, like heat on the back of his neck. Then it turned away and kept climbing, the trailing length behind it coiling and uncoiling as it moved. From the haze came a faint sound, not quite a voice, not quite an animal. It rose and fell like a slow chant, with gaps that felt deliberate. The older man glanced at Ash. "Too early for that." Ash nodded, still calm, though his fingers tapped against the wall in a slow, uneven rhythm. Caleb tried to see further into the haze, but the shimmer made the distances collapse. What seemed a few yards away shifted to look like miles, and what seemed far off loomed suddenly close before fading again. A shape emerged briefly in the air above the haze, thin, jointed, with long, frayed edges that fluttered without wind. It hovered for a few moments, then drifted back down, vanishing below the broken horizon. The chanting sound grew fainter, replaced by a deep, steady rumble that made the slope vibrate. The black fragments shifted minutely underfoot, their edges catching the dull light. Ash straightened. Time to go. It's starting to move. Neither Caleb nor the older man asked what it was. They turned back toward the blocks, the haze at their backs. Caleb couldn't resist one last glance and thought he saw something vast sliding slowly just beneath the surface of the shimmer, like the shadow of a ship passing under ice. The way back should have been the same road. Caleb recognized the first stretch, the low mounds with their coin-sized holes breathing damp air. But something was off. The holes were deeper now, some wide enough to fit a hand inside, and a faint, steady clicking came from within them, like teeth tapping together in the dark. Ash didn't stop, but the older man with the limp gave the mounds a wider berth than before. Further along, the cluster of pale, hairless creatures still sat near the gutter, but they weren't watching this time. They faced the wall, their heads tilted upward as if listening. One of them trembled faintly, though the air was still. No one said anything about it. The curtain of fibrous hair was gone from the doorway they'd passed earlier. In its place, something flat and gray hung. Not cloth, not hair, but a surface that looked like stretched skin, smooth and unbroken. It moved slightly as though something behind it was breathing. The older man muttered something under his breath. Ash's eyes flicked to the doorway, then away again. When they reached the cracked road with the wiry, twitching growths sprouting from the gaps, Caleb noticed the cracks themselves were wider, the growths thicker, with small bulbs forming at their tips. The bulbs pulsed faintly, in time with something. He couldn't tell if it was his own heartbeat or something else entirely. The jointed, oily creature they'd stepped over earlier was gone, but a thin black spine was stuck upright in the ground where it had been, quivering slightly, though there was no breeze. They turned a corner and found the wall with the round, head-sized indentations again. The lumps inside had changed color, from pale to a deep reddish brown. Some had split open, revealing smooth, dark pits inside. The clicking from the mounds seemed louder here. A man Caleb hadn't seen before stood by the wall, staring at one of the open pits. His eyes were wet, unfocused. Ash reached out and touched his shoulder lightly, but the man didn't respond. After a few seconds, Ash let go and kept walking. Even the air felt different, heavier, thicker, carrying a low hum at the edge of hearing. Caleb glanced at Ash, but his face was unreadable. The older man broke the silence first. "It wasn't like this when we came through." Ash only said, "It's closer today." The gates were open when they returned, though no one stood watch. That was wrong. Even Caleb knew it. Ash didn't comment, just passed under the heavy beams into the hold. The inside was dimmer than before, the sky above thick with that bruise-colored cloud that sometimes settled low. The air carried the faint smell of copper. The first person they passed, a tall woman in a patched leather coat, was sweeping the courtyard stones. Except she wasn't looking at them. Her gaze kept drifting to the wall, to the seams between the stones, as though she expected something to push through. A group of children played in the center, rolling a dented metal sphere between them, but their laughter was wrong. Quiet, almost whispered. One boy kept glancing toward the archway leading deeper into the hold. Caleb followed his look, but saw only shadow. The older man with the limp peeled away toward his quarters without saying goodbye. Ash stayed with Caleb, moving through the narrow walkways between stone buildings. On one wall, a pattern had appeared, a dark, branching stain, like veins spreading out from a single point. Caleb was sure it hadn't been there before they left. Two men sat on the steps of a storehouse, speaking in low voices. One stopped mid-sentence to look past Caleb, frowning. Caleb turned, but there was nothing behind him but the empty walkway. Inside the common hall, the changes were smaller, but no less unsettling. The long wooden table was damp in spots, though no one had spilled anything. A slow, rhythmic drip came from the ceiling, but there was no hole, no leak. A woman with sunken cheeks was seated near the fire, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. She didn't glance up when they passed, but her lips moved, whispering something soundless. Ash guided Caleb to a bench against the far wall. The benches were warm, too warm, as if they'd been sitting in sunlight, though the hall was cold. From outside, a noise rose briefly, a thin, drawn-out tone, almost like a horn, except it wavered and doubled back on itself. Conversations in the hall faltered. No one moved, but every head tilted slightly toward the sound. When it faded, Ash finally spoke. "It's coming inside sooner than I thought." He didn't explain what it was, and no one asked. By evening, the light outside the hold had taken on a dull, wine-colored hue. It came through the cracks between the buildings in thin lines, striping the dirt walkways. The air felt heavier still, not with heat, but with some quiet pressure that made people breathe slower. The common hall filled gradually. Ash sat with Caleb at one end of the long table while others drifted in. A mix of leather, patched cloth, and the occasional piece of metal armor dulled from years of wear. The tall woman with the patch coat sat across from them, running her fingers over the tabletop in small, deliberate circles. She didn't seem aware she was doing it. "You remember when we could leave the gates open all night?" she asked Ash, still looking at the table. Ash shrugged. "Before the pits got restless." That word, restless, caught Caleb's ear. He almost asked, but didn't. The older man with the limp came in last, lowering himself carefully onto the bench beside Caleb. "Feels quicker this time," he said, mostly to himself. "Used to take months for it to creep this far." Across the hall, the two men from the storehouse earlier were speaking in low tones again. Caleb caught fragments, shapes in the waterline, not the same faces, turned before we could see. Plates were brought out, flat stone slabs with strips of something blackened and curled on them. Caleb didn't recognize it as any kind of meat he knew, but he ate slowly, trying not to think about it. Conversation in the hall had a strange rhythm. It would flow for a few minutes, then stop abruptly, everyone pausing to listen, then resume as if nothing had happened. "Used to be the ground stayed the same," the tall woman said suddenly. "You could walk the same street every day, and it would be there tomorrow. Now," she made a twisting motion with her hand, "now it turns under your feet." The older man leaned toward Caleb, his voice low. "First time I saw it change, I thought I'd lost my way. Street bent itself into a curve that wasn't there the day before. Houses in different places. No one believed me for a year. Then it started happening to them too." Near the fire, the woman with the sunken cheeks had stopped sharpening her blade. She stared into the flames, unmoving, while her lips moved. Slower now, but still without sound. From somewhere deeper in the hold, a low groan sounded, not quite stone, not quite metal. People glanced at each other, not alarmed, but tense. Ash didn't look up from his food. "It's just settling," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. The hall stayed warm longer than it should have, the fire burning low, but the air holding on to heat. Caleb felt it on the back of his neck, like someone standing close. Most of the benches had emptied. The fire in the common hall was little more than a red bed of ash, breathing faintly. Caleb sat where he was, half drowsing, listening to the older man's uneven breathing beside him. Ash lingered near the doorway, watching the courtyard through the narrow gap. The hold was quieter than before, not silent, but the kind of quiet where each sound pressed against the ears. A faint dripping came from somewhere behind the wall, steady and hollow. The tall woman was still at the table across from Caleb. She hadn't moved in some time, her fingers resting lightly on the wood. Now she lifted them just slightly and frowned. "Feel that?" she asked. The wood was vibrating, not enough to rattle the cups or plates, but enough to be felt in the fingertips. The older man shifted, muttering, "Not now, not inside." Something gave a deep, slow creak, like beams under weight, but the roof above them stayed still. The sound came again, closer this time, and the floor seemed to settle under them, except it didn't settle back. Caleb glanced toward the long wall of the hall and stopped. The wall was bending. Not breaking or cracking, but bending as though it were soft. The row of hooks along it tilted at an angle, though nothing fell. The surface of the stone seemed to stretch, a faint ripple moving from one end to the other. Ash stepped forward, his voice low. "It's inside." From the corner near the fire, the woman with sunken cheeks let out a sharp breath. Not fear, exactly, but recognition. "First time it's moved here in years," she said, standing slowly. The ripple reached the far end of the wall and stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then the floor beneath the table shifted, not down, but sideways. The table legs scraped across the stone without anyone touching them. Cups rolled toward Caleb and clinked against his arm. Outside, in the courtyard, something metallic rang out, a long, drawn tone, as if a massive sheet of steel had been struck far away. Ash looked at the older man. "We need to watch where it goes." The tall woman stood, hand braced against the bending wall. "If it's twisting here, it's twisting outside, too." In the flickering light, Caleb saw something in her eyes, not panic, but the quiet, braced look of someone who had waited a long time for something they hoped wouldn't come. Then the floor shifted again, more sharply this time, and a crack appeared down the center of the hall. Not in the stone itself, but in the space, a thin black seam that swallowed the firelight. The door to the hall resisted opening. Ash pushed hard, shoulder braced, and it swung out with a shuddering scrape, as though the hinges had warped. The courtyard looked wrong before Caleb even stepped outside. The open space seemed narrower, as if the walls had leaned in. The lines of the stone underfoot were no longer straight. They curved gently, as though the ground itself had softened and sagged towards something in the center. The metallic tone from earlier came again, faint but clearer in the cool night air. The tall woman stopped mid-step, head tilted, listening. "It's further in," she murmured. A man Caleb didn't know was kneeling by the well in the middle of the yard. He wasn't drawing water, just staring into the opening, one hand pressed against the stones. "Feels different," he said without looking up. "Like it's breathing." The older man with the limp shuffled toward the outer wall. It should have been 20 paces to reach it, but Caleb felt like they got there too quickly, as if the courtyard had shrunk while they were watching. The wall itself was moving. Not fast, not even enough to see outright, but its surface pulsed faintly, in and out, like a slow heartbeat. The tall woman set her palm against it. "It used to take months before it touched the stone," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried in the still air. Ash scanned the perimeter, his jaw tight. "The watch should be here." "They're not," the woman replied. Caleb stepped back, looking around the courtyard again. The familiar angles of the hold had changed. Doorways slightly tilted, shadows stretched longer in some places, shorter in others, as though the light itself was bending. By the far corner, where the small garden had been, something new had appeared, a dark mound, half the height of a person, covered in slick, overlapping plates. It hadn't been there when they returned earlier. The man by the well finally looked up. "It's all inside now, every part of it." No one answered him. The only sound was the faint hum in the air, the one Caleb had first noticed on the walk back. It was stronger here, vibrating just enough to make his teeth ache. Ash turned toward the hall. "We need the others awake." The tall woman didn't move from the wall. "If it's changing this fast," she said, "you won't have time to wake them." They didn't sound an alarm. No bell, no call. People just began appearing, drawn by the changes the way animals might gather before a storm. Caleb counted 9 in the courtyard now. None spoke above a murmur. Some kept walking the perimeter, pressing their palms to the walls as though to feel how far the motion reached. Others stayed near the center, watching the ground. The tall woman still hadn't left her place at the wall. Her hand slid slowly across the stone, fingers tracing a new seam that hadn't been there an hour ago. "This is new," she said to no one in particular. "It wasn't laid by us." The older man with the limp had taken to pacing in tight circles, muttering numbers under his breath. Caleb caught fragments, 4 paces shorter, 5 degrees off. Near the well, the man who'd been listening to it now leaned over the edge, head tilted, his lips moving faintly. Caleb stepped closer and realized the man was repeating a single word over and over. It didn't sound like any language he knew. Ash moved from group to group, asking questions that got more shrugs than answers. "Was the garden already like that?" he asked one man, pointing toward the dark mound in the corner. The man glanced over, frowned, and shook his head slowly, as if trying to remember what had been there before. The mound shifted slightly then. Not much, just enough for its overlapping plates to catch the light from the torches. Several people noticed, but no one approached. From somewhere deeper in the hold came a short, sharp sound, like a length of wood snapping. Heads turned, but no one moved toward it. Caleb noticed the pathways between buildings weren't quite the same as when they'd arrived earlier. Some alleys had narrowed, their walls pressing inward, while others seemed to slope away, giving a faint impression of distance where there hadn't been any. A few residents were quietly testing them, walking down and back, their faces tense. "It's folding," the tall woman said suddenly, still watching the wall. "Not just bending, folding itself inward." Ash gave her a sharp look. "Don't say that here." She didn't reply, but she did take her hand off the wall at last. The hum in the air deepened for a moment, then faded again. Several people shifted uncomfortably, rubbing at their temples or jawlines. Caleb realized it wasn't just in the ears, it was in the bones. The courtyard felt smaller still. Caleb didn't know if it actually was, or if the angles just made it seem that way. No one told him which would be worse. They began drifting off in 2s and 3s, not with any clear command, just a silent agreement that the courtyard wasn't the only place shifting. Ash went with the older man toward the east corridor, the one that led to the watch platforms. The tall woman started toward the garden's dark mound, shadowed by a younger man with a scar running across his throat. Caleb hesitated until someone touched his shoulder. The well listener, eyes fixed past him. "Come," the man said. His voice was dry, almost unused. Caleb followed him through a short arch into what should have been the grain passage. The first thing he noticed was the ceiling, lower than before, close enough that the taller man had to duck. The second was the walls. They bowed inward, not much, but enough that their edges scraped Caleb's elbows when he walked. The floor dipped, then rose again, as though something massive had passed beneath it and never quite settled. Ahead, the hall widened unexpectedly into an open space. Caleb paused at the threshold. The room was round. He was certain it hadn't been round before, with 6 doorways leading out in all directions. Only 2 of those had existed earlier that day. The well listener walked straight to one of the new openings. "Don't follow," he said without looking back, and disappeared into the dark. Caleb stood there, unsure whether to go after him, until a faint scraping from behind pulled him around. The doorway he'd entered through was narrower. Not much, but enough that he felt the change. Somewhere deeper in the hold, Ash's voice echoed faintly. Not words, just a low call, cut short. From the direction of the garden, there came a soft, rhythmic sound, like something slowly clicking its teeth together. The tall woman's voice followed, sharp but steady. "Stay where you are." A figure appeared at one of the other doorways in the round room. Not the well listener, but someone Caleb didn't recognize. The man's skin had a faint sheen, as if damp, and his eyes didn't seem to focus on anything. He stepped forward once, then stopped, head tilting, listening. Caleb waited for him to speak, but he didn't. From somewhere beyond, a sudden rush of air passed through the hallways, carrying with it a dry, sweet smell that made Caleb's teeth ache again. It faded slowly, but the sensation stayed. The man in the doorway turned and walked away without a word. Ash led the way toward the east corridor, his lantern swinging low. The passage had always been straight, the stone floor even. Now it pitched and swayed like a deck on water. The older man had to keep one hand on the wall, his limp pulling sharper with every step. "It's leaning," he said through clenched teeth. "Not us. The whole thing's leaning." The further they went, the more the corridor seemed to angle upward, until their legs burned from climbing. The lantern light showed the far end receding, impossibly long. "We've walked enough to be past the east wall," the older man said, panting. "This shouldn't go on." Ash didn't answer. The air had thinned, not so much that it was hard to breathe, but enough that each inhale felt weak, unsatisfying. He caught himself taking shorter breaths, chest tightening. At the far end, the watch platform should have stood open to the outside. Instead, they reached a window no larger than a handspan across. Through it came nothing but blackness, deep enough to pull the eyes in and make the head swim. The older man stared at it too long. "It's eating the horizon," he whispered. Ash pulled him back. The stone beneath them trembled faintly, as though shifting under their weight. Neither suggested going further. The mound in the garden clicked again as they approached. Up close, it wasn't a mound at all. More like a cluster of layered shells, each slick and faintly translucent. Shapes moved under the plates, slow and deliberate. The scarred man crouched, eyes narrow. "It's warmer here," he murmured. His hand hovered over the surface but didn't touch. The tall woman circled it, noting how the soil near the base was darker, wet to the point of glistening. "Wasn't here before sundown," she said. A faint chime came from within the mound, like glass struck underwater. The scarred man flinched back, one hand gripping his own throat. His scar stood out white in the dim light. "You hear that in your bones," he said. The tall woman nodded. She looked past the mound toward where the garden wall met the courtyard's outer wall. The two no longer met. A sliver of shifting dark ran between them, flexing in and out like a slow breath. Her voice was quieter now. "It's widening." The scarred man stepped away from the mound, his hands trembling slightly. "This is how it starts." Neither of them went closer. Caleb remained in the round room, the 6 doorways watching him as much as he watched them. The narrowing of the one he'd entered through made the air feel heavier. He tested another doorway, stepping through into a short passage lined with uneven shelves carved directly into the stone. On them sat objects, tools, bowls, pieces of cloth, each one warped. A hammer's head was longer on one side than the other. A clay cup bulged in the middle like something had tried to force its way out. The cloth twisted on itself without moving, folds locked in unnatural curves. The air smelled faintly of rot and metal. Caleb's eyes watered, and for a moment he thought he heard a faint hiss from behind the shelves, though nothing moved. When he turned back toward the round room, the doorway seemed farther away. He felt the muscles in his legs tighten, the steps between seeming to stretch longer than they should. By the time he stepped back through, the hum in his bones had deepened again. He pressed his hands against his temples, but the vibration was in him, not around him. Somewhere far off, someone shouted. The sound carried down the warped hallways and faded like it had been swallowed. Caleb realized he wasn't sure which direction the courtyard was anymore. The first to feel it was Ash. He'd been standing at the narrow black window, his knuckles white around the lantern's handle, when the floor shifted beneath them. Not violently, but with a slow, tilting insistence, like a giant hand sliding the corridor downward. The older man grunted as his limp dragged harder. "Back," Ash said, though it wasn't clear if he meant retreating or simply keeping their balance. The slope carried them whether they stepped or not, the stone beneath their boots subtly slicker than it had been moments ago. The tall woman had her palm pressed to the garden wall when the same tilt rolled through her feet. Soil shifted, little stones tumbling toward the courtyard. The scarred man staggered once, then twice, before muttering something under his breath. The mound clicked again, a slower rhythm now, heavier. Several of its plates separated slightly, revealing a wet darkness between them before sealing shut again. The tall woman pointed to the sliver between the garden wall and the courtyard wall. "It's wider." The scarred man looked but didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the ground, which now had a faint slope toward the courtyard gate. Caleb's round room had begun to feel skewed, not spinning exactly, but as though the floor and walls were agreeing on a new shape without asking him first. He stepped toward one of the doorways, not the one he'd entered through, and found it led somewhere else entirely, a short ramp angling down, the same sweet, dry smell hanging heavy in the air. A distant vibration passed through the stone, deep enough to make his knees loosen. He wasn't walking toward the courtyard, but the ramp curved and curved until, without meaning to, he saw torchlight flickering ahead, torchlight from the same courtyard he had left earlier. They began arriving in uneven pairs, Ash with the older man moving stiffly, the tall woman and the scarred man, their clothes dusted with loose soil, Caleb from the ramp. They didn't greet each other. The courtyard had changed again. It was smaller, noticeably so. The well now stood nearly against the outer wall. The black plates of the mound leaned toward it, their curve echoing the round lip of the well. The hum in the air was stronger here, enough to set teeth on edge. No one sat, no one leaned on the walls. They just stood, the weight of the space pressing closer. The tall woman's voice was low. "It's folding us in." No one argued. From somewhere beyond the hold's walls, something answered, a slow, drawn-out creak, like wood under strain, but too deep to be wood. The creak came again, closer, wetter. Then the courtyard floor shifted once more, but not like before. This time it pulsed. Caleb's first thought was that it was breathing. The well shuddered. Its stones groaned and pushed outward, as though something beneath them wanted more space. A low, wet suction came from inside, and the air filled with the copper tang of fresh blood. The mound by the garden twitched, every plate flexing, then peeled open all at once. Inside was no cavity, no familiar anatomy, just a tunnel of glistening flesh that descended straight into the well's shadow. The plates twisted inwards, grinding over each other in a slow spiral. The older man stumbled back. "It's all one thing," he whispered. Then the courtyard floor split, not with a sharp crack, but with a soft tearing sound, like thick hide being pulled apart. Beneath the stone was no soil, only muscle, dark and fibrous, stretching down into something vast. The hum in their bones became a roar. Ash grabbed the older man by the arm, pulling him toward the ramp Caleb had come from. The tall woman pushed the scarred man ahead of her, shouting for Caleb without looking back. The tearing widened, walls bowed inward, then collapsed entirely into the chasm of flesh. The city beyond screamed, human voices, wood snapping, stone grinding, as the streets themselves tilted toward the hold. Caleb ran with them, the ramp shaking underfoot. Behind him, the courtyard was gone, replaced by a massive, slow-closing maw lined with wet stone teeth. The mound's plates folded over it, locking in place, sealing whatever lay beneath. They emerged into a narrow alley just as the ground pitched again, the far wall of the street folding into the sinkhole where the hold had stood. The smell of blood was overwhelming. From a rooftop above, Caleb caught one last glimpse of the city's edge, streets bending inward like the spokes of a wheel, all drawing into the single point where the hold had been. The sound it made as it swallowed the last of the city was not a roar, not a scream, just the slow, satisfied click of those massive plates sealing shut. And then, silence. They didn't speak at first, not because there was nothing to say, the questions clawed at all of them, but because the sound of the hold sinking still echoed in their skulls, and no one wanted to be the first to break it. The alley ended in what had once been the outer streets. Now it was a shallow slope of fractured stone and dust leading toward the wasteland. Beyond that, nothing but a haze that blurred the horizon. Ash went first, the older man leaning on him heavily. The tall woman and scarred man followed, their eyes flicking back often, as if expecting the plates to rise again from the rubble. Caleb trailed last. The city's edge had no gate anymore, just a jagged tear where wall met emptiness. The ground beyond was not soil, but a crust of blackened earth, cracked in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. The moment their boots crossed onto it, the air changed. It was dry in a way that scraped the throat raw, carrying a faint vibration underfoot. Not loud, just constant, like standing too close to a vast engine. They walked in silence for what felt like hours. The skyline of the city behind them slumped lower and lower until only a few broken towers remained above the dust. The scarred man finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "It's still moving." Caleb glanced back. He couldn't see anything moving, but the dust over the city's ruins swirled in slow spirals, as if drawn inward. The older man stopped to catch his breath. His hands shook as he unwrapped a strip of cloth from his wrist, revealing skin that was mottled dark where the hold's hum had been strongest. "Feels like it's still in me," he muttered. The tall woman took the strip from him and rewrapped it tighter. She looked out over the wasteland, eyes narrowing. "We keep going. If it comes up again, it won't stop at the city." The land ahead was uneven, low ridges of stone, scattered heaps of bone-like shapes, and occasional pools of stagnant liquid that reflected nothing of the sky. Once, Caleb thought he saw movement under the crust, a ripple far off. But when he blinked, it was gone. The air grew heavier the further they went, and the vibration underfoot deepened until it felt like the ground itself had a pulse. They didn't know if they were putting distance between themselves and the thing, or walking along its spine. The ridges grew taller, forcing them to wind between narrow passes. The air had a faint taste now, metallic, almost sweet, and the vibration underfoot came and went like a far-off tide. They saw the first movement at the base of a ridge, a long, slow fold of pale material sliding back into the earth, like a tongue retreating into a mouth. There was no sound except the faint hiss of sand falling into the gap it left. No one spoke, but they walked wider around that spot. The second movement was harder to ignore. Ahead, the ground seemed to swell, not in one lump, but in dozens of small humps, each no larger than a fist. As they neared, each one opened, revealing a wet, dark center lined with hair-fine filaments that quivered in the air. The older man stopped, staring. They're breathing. The humps tilted toward them slightly, the filaments curling and uncurling. The tall woman stepped in front of him, hand raised. "Keep moving. Don't touch." They passed between the humps slowly, boots crunching on the crust. Caleb kept his eyes forward, though he swore he felt one of the filaments brush his ankle. The ridges beyond opened into a basin. It was wider than the courtyard had been, and in its center stood something like a tree. But instead of bark, Its trunk was layers of chitinous plates, and its branches ended in flat, disc-like growths that trembled faintly. Ash murmured, "Wind's not strong enough for that." The discs all faced toward them at once. Not a sound, not a lunge, just every surface turning, as if watching. The scarred man muttered under his breath, not the hold, but kin to it. Something far away made a low, rising note, too deep to tell if it was a call or the ground itself shifting. The discs tilted toward that sound, then slowly folded inward, closing like the lids of great eyes. The tall woman motioned for them to keep moving, and they did, not daring to look back this time. As the basin fell behind them, the vibration returned under their feet, stronger now and not steady. It was coming in beats, heartbeats. By the third day, if it could be called a day in the dim, colorless haze, their shadows had begun to fade, not shorten, not lengthen, just pale, as if whatever faint light there was couldn't be bothered to reach them anymore. The ridges ahead formed a shallow bowl littered with shards of black glass the size of fingernails. They crunched underfoot, producing a sound too crisp, too sharp for the muffled air. Caleb noticed first. At the center of the bowl, where the crust dipped lowest, something moved. Not quickly, not with any pattern he could follow. It was a shape, but not one that stayed the same for more than a breath. A mass of angles that folded into curves, then into nothing, then into something worse. Every time it changed, the glass under their feet sang faintly. Ash slowed, his grip on the older man tightening. "We shouldn't." The thing spoke. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't sound. It was the memory of a word placed directly into the mind, bypassing ears entirely. "You are displaced." Caleb's stomach clenched, not at the meaning, but at the sense that this was not the first time he had heard it. The tall woman stepped forward, her hands curled into fists. "Why here?" The shape shifted, briefly resembling a torso, then shattering into insect limbs, then collapsing into a spiral that devoured its own center. "Here is not here." The scarred man's breath quickened. "It's feeding it," he whispered. "It is not feeding." The word this time pressed like a weight against their ribs. "It is becoming." The older man swayed, his knees giving out. Ash caught him just as the glass around the creature began to vibrate, each shard rising a finger's width from the ground, trembling. Caleb forced the words out. "Becoming what?" The thing turned toward him, or maybe all of it turned, every impossible surface now angled to see him. What you call the hold is not fixed. It is not bound. It moves. It learns. And it must finish before the rest wakes. Caleb's mouth went dry. The rest? No answer, only a slow, expanding silence, the kind that made the bones in their heads ache. Then the shape collapsed inward, folding into itself until it vanished completely. The shards of glass dropped with a sound like rain on stone. No one moved for a long time. Finally, the tall woman turned, her voice flat. "We keep walking, and we hope we're walking away from whatever the rest is." They walked until the air grew thicker, until breathing felt like dragging glass through the lungs. The ridges smoothed into wide plains, but the plains were not still. The ground shifted in small, twitching ripples, not enough to topple them, but enough to make each step uncertain. Caleb tried not to look too far ahead because the horizon was no longer straight. It bent, ever so slightly, as though something beneath the crust was pushing it upward. Ash kept glancing down as if checking to see if his feet were where he thought they were. "Feels like walking on skin," he muttered. The older man stumbled, catching himself on Caleb's arm. When he stood again, Caleb noticed something. The man's boots had left no prints behind them. The dust had closed in over their path, erasing their passage entirely. The tall woman saw it too. "It doesn't want us remembered," she said. not looking at them. They reached a shallow basin where the ground was veined with something dark, pulsing faintly beneath the surface. It was not liquid. It was more like the shadow of liquid, flowing through channels in the stone. The scarred man crouched, pressing his ear to the ground. He jerked back almost immediately, pale. There's talking, far below. Too many voices to make sense. As they crossed the basin, the ridges at its far end shifted, not crumbling, not sliding, moving. Each ridge curved inward, forming slow arcs that rose higher as they approached. Caleb's throat tightened. They weren't ridges, they were ribs. Between them, the air shimmered like heat haze, and faint shapes moved just beyond sight. Not solid, not entirely real, but there. Long arms that bent the wrong way, faces without mouths. The ground under Caleb's feet gave a single heavy thump, not like an earthquake, but like a massive heart completing one slow beat. Ash whispered, "That's not the hold." The tall woman's voice was barely audible. "Number, that's the rest." The haze thickened, bending the light until it was hard to tell where the ground ended and the air began. The shadows within it moved closer, and though they made no sound, Caleb felt their attention like a hand pressing down on the back of his neck. Then the pulse came again, slower, heavier, and the shadows stopped. For now, the haze thinned with distance, and the land sloped downward into a cluster of leaning structures. Not wood, not stone, but a pale, fibrous material that looked as if it had once been alive. At first glance, the settlement seemed abandoned. No movement, no sound. Then Caleb noticed the curtains, if they could be called that, shifting in doorways. A slow, deliberate movement, as though someone was pulling them back just enough to watch. They walked in on a road of black, fused sand. It bent under their feet like cartilage. A man emerged from one of the huts, thin, dressed in a patchwork of cloth and leather. His skin was unnaturally smooth, the pores too small, the hairline too perfect. He didn't greet them, didn't ask questions. He just pointed toward the far edge of the settlement, where the ground dipped sharply. The tall woman frowned. "We're not staying here." The man lowered his arm, then pointed again. Slower this time, more insistent. They followed his gesture from a distance, weaving between houses that leaned toward each other like eavesdroppers. A few more residents appeared in doorways, all thin, all too smooth, but none spoke. At the edge, they found the dip. It was no natural sink. The ground had been peeled back in a spiral, the surface fibers frayed as if torn by massive hands. At its center was a hole, perfectly round, perfectly black. From here, the air pouring out was colder than anything they'd felt since leaving the city. It smelled faintly of iron and damp stone. The older man took a step toward it, but Ash grabbed his arm. "Don't." The scarred man crouched, peering over the lip. His voice was low. "It goes down farther than light can follow." Something in the dark moved, not toward them, but deeper, as though receding into a space far larger than the opening should allow. Behind them, the tall woman glanced back at the settlement. All the residents now stood outside their homes, perfectly still, watching. Caleb felt it in his chest before he realized he was holding his breath. The faint, rhythmic pull of air moving in and out of the hole, like the breathing of something sleeping far, far below. And then, for just an instant, a whisper curled up from the black. Not words, more like the shape of words. Familiar in a way that made his teeth ache. Ash swallowed. "If we go down there, we don't come back the same." The tall woman's voice was steady, but her hands were clenched white. "We might not come back at all." They did not speak to the residents again. No one told them to go. No one told them to stay. The spiral cut into the earth was wide enough for two people side by side, but they kept in single file. The fibrous ground underfoot was slick, and the cold that bled from the hole had teeth, sharp, deliberate ones. With every turn of the spiral, the light from above thinned, not because of depth alone, but because the air grew thick, pressing against the eyes. Caleb realized after the third turn that the shadows of the group were stretching upward toward the surface instead of downward toward the next step. The older man's breathing was loud, ragged. "Feels wrong," he said, but no one answered. The walls were alive with texture, layered ridges, grooves deep enough to hide an arm in. Some were warm to the touch, some cold. None matched the material of the surface. Caleb kept his hands close to himself. By the seventh turn, the spiral opened into a wide landing. From here, a single tunnel led on, not cut, not carved, but grown. It curved in gentle arcs, and the walls pulsed faintly, their sheen catching what little light they carried. Ash knelt briefly, touching the ground. His hand came away, damp. "It's sweating." They went on. The deeper they walked, the harder it became to tell if the sound in their ears was their own breath or something else. A slow, low resonance that wasn't quite a hum, wasn't quite a growl. It was inside their chests more than their ears. The scarred man halted, tilting his head. "Listen." They froze. Somewhere far ahead, the tunnel exhaled, not just a rush of air, but a release, a loosening, like the first deep sigh after long restraint. The tall woman took a step forward. The older man grabbed her sleeve. "We should—" The walls quivered. It was subtle, no more than the shiver of muscle beneath skin, but it traveled the length of the passage ahead, vanishing into the dark. And in that moment, Caleb knew, without reason, without evidence, that the thing breathing here was not asleep. It was waiting. The tunnel widened slowly, as if reluctant to let them through. The air grew denser, each breath dragging in weight rather than wind. The damp became a thin mist that clung to their hair, their eyelashes. The sound was louder now, not a pulse exactly, too uneven for that. But there was rhythm in it, something between breathing and the churn of ocean tides. Then the tunnel curved one last time, and they emerged into the chamber. It wasn't a room, it wasn't even space in the way space should work. The ceiling arched high above, but its height shifted with each glance, low enough to touch one moment, then vanishing into shadow the next. In the center was it, a mass of living flesh the size of a hill, suspended in midair by thick, sinewed cords that anchored into the walls like roots. The surface of it rippled with constant movement, folds opening and closing in ways that made the stomach twist. Veins the width of tree trunks pumped some black, sluggish ichor into and out of it, vanishing deep into the walls. And then came the realization. It was a heart. Not shaped like the humankind, but pumping all the same. Each beat sent a shudder through the floor, the walls, and through the thin fibers of their own bodies. Caleb's mouth tasted of copper. His vision swam with every contraction. The tall woman staggered forward as if compelled. "It's alive," she whispered, though the word was laughably small for what this was. Alive, the chamber echoed, not in voice but in sensation, a word pressed directly into their bones. The older man clutched his chest, his breathing ragged. "It's speaking. Not to you," the word shape pulsed again. "Through you." The scarred man stepped back, his eyes wide, his hands shaking. This is it. This is the center. Everything else, all of it, is just skin." A fissure opened along one side of the heart. Not a wound, not a mouth, but something halfway between. From within came a lightless depth, darker than the black around it, and shapes moved there, things that may have been limbs or thoughts or both. Caleb's knees threatened to give. The air pressed harder, urging them to breathe with the same rhythm as the heart. You beat because I beat. You end because I stop. Ash's voice was hoarse, desperate. Then why are we here? The fissure widened. For a moment, Caleb thought he saw his own face inside it, and behind that, the faces of strangers, all trapped in that slow, endless movement. To keep me warm. The beat grew heavier, and with it, the mist thickened. Somewhere in the haze, the walls began to close. The chamber did not breathe. They did, and it matched them, or made them match it. Caleb couldn't tell anymore. The fissure along the heart's side flexed, like a muscle testing its own tension. From it came that same black depth, a gravity that had nothing to do with mass. The tall woman took a single step forward. "It's calling us," she said, but her voice was not awed. It was flat, almost resigned, as if the call had been there all along and she'd simply stopped pretending to ignore it. Ash shook his head, but his feet slid forward with hers, unsteady, as if the ground itself tilted them toward the center. "It doesn't want to hurt us." Caleb almost laughed, but the sound caught in his throat. "You don't know that." The older man leaned heavily on his knees, sweat dripping from his chin. "Maybe it's never needed to hurt. Maybe we've already done what it wanted before we were born." They were halfway across the chamber now. The cords holding the heart were thick enough to walk across, but their surfaces twitched in subtle, unsettling ripples. The smell here was heavier, not rot, but the metallic sweetness of fresh blood. Caleb's gaze caught on one of the vein trunks. Inside, something moved, not the ichor, but shapes within the ichor, tumbling slowly, like leaves in a river current. Some were vaguely human, others had too many joints, too many bends. Ash reached out without thinking, his hand hovering inches from the vein's warm, trembling surface. If we could just... The heart thumped. Not hard, not loud, but deep. The sound went through their bones, through the ground, through the liquid in their eyes. The fissure widened and the black inside swirled like ink dropped in water. From it, shapes emerged, not fully, but enough to be felt. Fingers that were not fingers brushing along their thoughts. The sensation was almost gentle. Almost. The tall woman whispered something, not in a language Caleb knew, but it sounded like she'd been speaking it all her life. The scarred man crouched, staring into the fissure as though into a familiar home. His voice was calm. "We were born in the wrong direction. This is where it begins." Caleb didn't realize he'd taken another step until the pulse rattled his ribs, and he was close enough to see pores in the heart's surface. It wasn't just alive. It was aware, and it knew exactly who each of them was. Caleb was the first to see the ripple, not in the heart's surface, but in the air between him and it. A distortion, like heat rising from asphalt, bending the space just enough to catch the eye. The fissure flexed. Something spilled out. Not a liquid, not light, but moments. It came to him in a rush, the taste of oranges his mother had peeled for him when he was 6, the smell of dust on a summer window, the way the light had touched the floor of his childhood bedroom in thin golden strips. His eyes stung, though he hadn't blinked. Beside him, Ash stopped walking, his lips parted, his breath shallow. It's showing me." He cut himself off, his jaw tightening. But Caleb saw his hand tremble, and the faintest smile, real, aching, touched his mouth. The tall woman's head tilted sharply, her eyes darted left, right, as if following something invisible through the air. No, you're wrong," she muttered, but there was no one there. The older man sank to his knees, his hands curled into the fibrous floor as if afraid he'd float away. "I hear her," he whispered, voice breaking. "She's still in there, still in me." The fissure widened a fraction more. Now Caleb saw more than memories. He saw possibilities. He was standing in a sunlit kitchen, barefoot on cool tiles, the smell of fresh bread wrapping around him. Someone was humming in the next room, and then, just at the edge of hearing, the pulse, slow, deep, matching the warmth in his chest. He blinked and the kitchen was gone. The chamber was still there, the mist thicker now, curling in slow, deliberate spirals. One of the cords anchoring the heart twitched violently, sending a vibration up through the floor. The scarred man was closer to the fissure than any of them now. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on the black within. "It can give it back," he murmured. "It can give all of it back." Caleb took a step toward him without realizing it. The space felt softer here, like walking through water. Each breath was warm in his throat, too warm, as though it had already been inside something else before it reached his lungs. The heart pulsed again. The fissure swelled. And this time, when the darkness inside shifted, Caleb swore he saw something moving toward them, not slowly, not idly, but with purpose. The fissure tore wider with a sound like wet fabric splitting. The mist thickened, not swirling now, but surging, flowing toward them in long, searching tendrils. Ash swore under his breath, stepping back, but his foot landed wrong on the slick fibers, and he slipped to one knee. The moment his hand touched the ground, the floor responded. It clenched. Not like a trap snapping shut, but like a muscle cramping, slow and inescapable. Tendrils coiled up around his wrist, warm and slick, threading into the cuff of his sleeve. He shouted, yanking hard, but the fibers tightened, pulling him toward the center. The scarred man didn't move to help. He was already almost to the fissure, both arms outstretched, his face slack with awe. "It's not attacking," he said. "It's embracing us." The black within the fissure surged forward. Something vast and jointless emerged. Not a limb, not a tentacle, but a curve of flesh studded with wet, unblinking eyes. They rolled in unison toward the scarred man. And then it struck. The movement was faster than thought. One moment, the scarred man was standing. The next, the thing had wrapped around him, folding his body into its flesh like dough being kneaded. He didn't scream. He laughed, a sound of cracked relief, until the sound muffled into silence. Caleb lunged for Ash, grabbing his free arm. The older man joined him, teeth bared as he pulled, but the floor only yielded enough to give them hope before another pulse from the heart tightened it again. The tall woman was shouting something, not in any language Caleb knew, as she tore at the tendrils with her hands. Dark ichor sprayed from the wounds, hot and acrid, stinging their skin. Ash's voice broke. "It's pulling me." The mist rose higher, swallowing them to the waist. Shapes moved in it, not physical, not entirely, brushing through their ribs, their spines, whispering thoughts that weren't theirs. Caleb caught fragments. "Let go. You're already home. You've been here longer than you remember." The older man lost his grip on Ash as one of the cords from the heart itself lashed out. It pierced straight through Ash's back, emerging from his chest in a slow, deliberate push. His breath hitched, eyes wide. He looked at Caleb once, not in terror but in apology, before the cord retracted, dragging him into the fissure. The sound when he vanished was wet and final. "Move!" the tall woman snapped, shoving Caleb toward the far edge of the chamber. The heart pulsed again, and the entire floor convulsed, throwing them off balance. The fissure yawned wider, spilling more mist, more shapes, more heat. They ran, not toward the tunnel they'd entered from. That was gone, sealed behind a living wall of flesh, but toward a narrow gap in the far side of the chamber, barely wide enough for one at a time. Behind them, the heart's rhythm grew frantic, and with every beat the chamber shrank. The tunnel swallowed them in one jagged breath. The walls were slick and narrow, grinding against their shoulders as they ran, bending them forward into a crouch that made speed almost impossible. Every step was a stumble in the half-dark, lit only by the faint, nauseous glow bleeding through the living walls. The tall woman was ahead, forcing her way forward with brutal efficiency, tearing away the pulsing tissue that tried to knit itself closed in their path. Caleb followed close, the older man behind him, his ragged breathing louder than the pounding of their feet. Something followed. The heart's pulse was still there, echoing down the tunnel in deep vibrations that made the flesh under their hands quiver. Every few seconds, the tremor spiked, and a wet, tearing sound echoed behind them, the walls themselves splitting open as something pushed through. A tendril lashed into the tall woman's leg. She screamed, not in fear, but in fury, and stabbed at it with a shard of bone she'd been carrying since the waists. The tendril recoiled, but the wall to her left bulged and burst, spilling a flood of smaller, eel-like things that wrapped around her arms. "Keep going," she snarled at Caleb. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, one of the eels bit deep into her throat. She didn't make a sound this time, just looked at him once, her eyes sharp even as the life drained out. The older man shoved Caleb forward. "Move." They scrambled over the tall woman's body, the tunnel narrowing until they were crawling on hands and knees. The smell here was worse, copper and rot, with a sweet undertone that made Caleb's stomach clench. The older man slipped. His hand punched through the floor, and before Caleb could reach for him, the flesh beneath his arm split wide, teeth lining the wound. They clamped down in a slow, deliberate bite. He didn't scream. His face was pale, set, as he yanked at his arm. But the teeth only tightened. The tunnel's walls rippled, closing in around him like a throat. "Go," he said, his voice a rasp. "Don't make it waste you, too." Caleb went. He didn't look back. The tunnel spat him out without warning. One moment he was crawling. The next, he was tumbling forward into a drop. He hit the floor hard, his palms smacking against something cold and smooth. And then he saw where he was. The chamber was vast, impossibly so, a cathedral built for something too large to kneel. The ceiling was lost in shadow. Towering pillars of black stone rose from the floor, some cracked open to reveal slow-moving rivers of molten flesh inside. At the center, far away but perfectly visible, something stood, or knelt, or waited. Its shape was wrong, constantly wrong, twisting between forms faster than his eyes could follow, but always radiating a gravity that pulled at his thoughts. He realized dimly that it was looking at him. The air was wrong here. It wasn't heavy in the way of heat or dust. It was heavy in thought. Every breath Caleb took seemed to press something inside him downward, into a deeper place where nothing could move freely. He didn't want to go forward, but his feet took him forward anyway. Not by compulsion, he wasn't being controlled, but because stillness here felt worse than walking. The sound was the first thing that made him falter. Not a roar, not even a hum, but a steady, low resonance that his bones recognized before his ears did. It wasn't coming from the walls or the floor. It was coming from inside him. The entity at the center shifted again, its outline smearing into dozens of silhouettes before condensing into something vaguely vertical. Limbs, spines. He couldn't tell. And every time his mind tried to anchor to a detail, the rest of its form rotted into shapes that didn't belong in this world. He knew it was looking at him. There were no eyes, yet the knowledge sat in his gut like a swallowed stone. His mouth was dry. He hadn't spoken since the tunnel. He didn't think he could, and then the thought arrived, whole and absolute, inside his head. "You have walked a long way to be here." It wasn't a voice. It wasn't even language, just the shape of meaning, folding into him like the slow pull of a tide. Caleb opened his mouth anyway. "Why am I here?" The pillars trembled. One of them cracked open further, the molten flesh inside twitching in response. The meaning came again. Because you remain. That was all. Not an explanation, not a reason, just a truth so bare it left him cold. He took another step, though his legs shook. The smooth floor rippled under his feet, forming shallow ridges like veins in stone. With each pulse of the room, they rearranged themselves, subtly guiding him toward the center. The closer he came, the more his head filled with other things. Memories that weren't his. Faces screaming in tongues he didn't know. Oceans without water, where towers of bone rose from an endless plain. And underneath it all, the deep understanding that none of these things were in the past or future. They were all now. He slowed, and the weight grew. The pressure behind his eyes built until his vision blurred, his knees buckling. You will not leave here as you are, the meaning pressed into him. If you leave at all. A dull ache swelled in his chest. Not fear, not even dread, but a hollow certainty. The kind of certainty that made hope feel ridiculous, like a child's story told to make the night less dark. He wasn't getting out. Not from here. And still the thing waited, the slow pulse of the chamber sinking to his heart until he could no longer tell which beat belonged to which. Caleb's knees met the cold floor with a dull smack. It wasn't a conscious choice. His body folded in on itself, his arms hanging uselessly at his sides. The air here felt thick enough to drown in, every breath slower than the last, every thought taking longer to form. He wasn't sure when he had stopped thinking about escape. The word itself felt foreign now, belonging to some other man who had died in a tunnel a lifetime ago. The entity loomed without moving, and yet its presence swelled until it felt like there was no space in the chamber that wasn't already filled by it. Its shifting form had grown quieter, slower, as though it were settling into whatever shape was needed for this. You are tired. The meaning pressed into him, not as a question but as a verdict. He didn't try to argue. Something inside him, something stubborn and human, tried to picture what resistance would look like. Maybe he'd run, maybe he'd try to fight, just for the spite of it. But the thought dissolved before it finished forming. What? What do you want from me? The words left his mouth in a rasp, his lips dry and cracking. The floor between them split open, slowly, lovingly. A wide, shallow groove spread outward from the entity's base, filled not with darkness, but with a thin, pale liquid that steamed against the cold air. It pulsed with the same rhythm as the chamber, as his heart. The meaning came again. Not from you. Of you. Caleb's breathing hitched. It wasn't asking for his blood, or his life. It was asking for him, whatever that meant here, in this place where meaning bent until it broke. The pulse in his ears deepened, a low bass hum that made the floor shiver under his palms. His mind felt like a room being emptied, one thought at a time, until there was only one left. He leaned forward, placing his hands into the groove. The liquid was warm, almost gentle, but the moment it touched his skin, it climbed him. Not like water, not soaking, but entering, threading through his veins, his muscles, his bones. His mouth opened in a soundless gasp as something in him gave way, a latch unhooked, a door left swinging. He wasn't holding on to himself anymore. The entity's shifting slowed to almost nothing. For the first time, it resembled something still, though Caleb could not have said what. Its presence pressed closer, not crushing, but enveloping. You remain, the meaning came, softer this time, and now it felt almost satisfied. Caleb's eyes burned, but he didn't blink. Whatever had been keeping him upright inside his own head had gone quiet. He wasn't sure if he was kneeling anymore, or if the floor had taken him. At first it felt like drowning, but drowning in himself. The warm liquid in the groove surged through his veins until every heartbeat was a hammer strike against the inside of his ribs. His vision went white, not from light, but from the sheer weight of sensation. Then the tearing began. It wasn't his skin, not yet, but something deeper. His muscles knotted hard enough to rip themselves, his bones bending like softened metal, cracking with each breath. Every joint screamed, then snapped, then reset into angles that didn't belong to a human frame. He tried to scream, but the sound was stolen before it left his mouth. The entity was in the sound, tasting it, feeding on it, stretching it into vibrations that rattled the walls of the chamber. The white in his vision split open, revealing moments he could not have lived. And yet, they tore through him as if they had. 1,000 days of starvation under a sky that never dimmed. Skin blistering into open sores that refused to heal. The slow suffocation of lungs filling with something thick and warm. And then, something worse. Memories, not just his. He saw his mother's face in the moment she realized she would not be saved. The expression of the tall woman as the eels wrapped her throat. The last breath of the older man, swallowed by teeth in the dark. They looped, over and over, until time was nothing but a reel of endings. He didn't fight it. He couldn't. His mind had no edges left. At some point, he couldn't tell when, the pain became so constant, so absolute, that it stopped feeling like pain at all and turned into a single, unbroken state of being. He wasn't in a body anymore. He was just in this. The entity's meaning came one last time, quieter than before. You remain. The world dropped out from under him. He woke lying on a hardwood floor. Cold air pricked his skin. His ears rang, but it was the sharp, familiar ringing of blood rushing back to a waking body. He knew this room. The stained wallpaper, the crooked lamp in the corner, the window with one cracked pane. Above him, the noose swayed gently from the ceiling beam. The rope was snapped clean through, the fibers frayed as if they had been pulled apart in one violent motion. His breath caught, shallow and fast. His knees ached, not from whatever had just happened, but from the position he'd been in before he fell. Caleb pressed a hand to the floor, the grain under his palm solid, real, human. For a long moment, he just stared at the broken rope. Then, with trembling hands, he pulled it down and stuffed it into the trash bin. The air still felt heavy, but it wasn't the weight of the chamber. It was the weight of being here, again. Somehow. He didn't know if he'd been spared, or returned, or punished, but he knew he was still breathing. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the far wall. The sound felt wrong here, after everything. It was too gentle, too small, like a sound from a world that belonged to someone else. Caleb sat on the floor, knees pulled up, eyes fixed on the broken rope lying in the trash. His fingers still itched with the phantom heat of the liquid from the chamber. Every few seconds he would flex his hands just to remind himself they were still his. The smell of the room was stale. Wood dust, old coffee, and the faint copper tang of his own sweat. But beneath it, in a place no scent should reach, he swore he could still taste the air of that other place. He closed his eyes, trying to pull the memories into order, but they refused. They came in flashes, the ridged floor guiding his feet, the endless walls of molten flesh, the shifting shape at the center. And that phrase, not spoken, not written, just pressed into his skull. You remain. It echoed now like it had been waiting here for him, patient and certain. Caleb leaned his head back against the wall, letting the cold soak into his neck. He couldn't tell if it had been a dream, if it was some desperate flicker of his brain fighting against the dark as the rope tightened, or if, for a brief and terrible stretch of time, he had really been there. If he had been taken, then maybe it was still there. Maybe it was always there. A thought slipped into his head before he could stop it. when his time really came, not by his own hand, but by the slow turn of years, would he open his eyes there again? Would it be waiting for him? Would it say those same words? Would it welcome him back like it had never let him go? He didn't know. He didn't think he wanted to. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a part of him listened for that pulse,